Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6. Believe it or not, we are here. And so, we're going to be talking this week about abstract expressionism, and I'm going to be focusing a good bit of our conversation today on Barnett Newman and the search for the sublime. Because I think other folks in the movement, such as Jackson Pollock, are probably more well known, but Barnett Newman wrote so much. So, we're going to get into that a little bit. We're also going to talk a little bit about Mark Rothko. But I want today to start by talking about Clement Greenberg. Clement Greenberg is one of the most important critics of this era, whether or not you necessarily agree with him or like his style of writing, since you've gotten into it a little bit. I think it's important to at least mention for a couple of reasons. Formalism is going to be huge to the abstract expressionist movement, and his approach to art criticism was avowedly formalist. He believed that although form may not be the total purpose of art, it offers the really only firm basis on which you can make judgments on quality and assessments about the kind of relative character of different works of art. He argued that it's so easy to make contradictory assertions about subject matter in art that any discussion of subject was essentially without purpose. Let's talk only about form. And for painting, according to Greenberg, this meant two things. First, essentially, what happens is this purification of painting in this era, um, a purification of any of the effects of other artistic mediums like sculpture, theater, or literature. Basically, he's saying that painting can't be three-dimensional because that's the domain of sculpture, and it can't be representational because that's the domain of literature, and it can't generate dramatic effects outside of its material because that's the domain of theater. And the second aspect of painting is this critique of itself that's a stress on the limitations that constitute the medium of painting, if that makes sense. So the limitations of painting consist of three things: the flat surface, the shape of the support, meaning the canvas or paper or panel, and then the innate properties, the viscosity, etc., of paint itself. And the flatness of the support was the most important limitation modernism could critique, according to Greenberg, because flatness is unique to the medium of painting. The fact that paper or canvas is inherently flat. Basically, he says, historically, realistic illusionistic art has attempted to get around this flatness using art to conceal art, but modernism, and he says starting with Manet, uses art to call attention to art, to call attention to itself. So getting into this a little bit more, in 1950, he joined the government-funded American Committee for Cultural Freedom. He basically believed that modernism provided a critical commentary on experience, and it's constantly constantly changing to adapt to kitsch pseudo-culture, which itself is always developing. So basically, in the years after World War II, he pushed this position that the very best avant-garde artists were emerging in America as opposed to Europe. In particular, he championed Jackson Pollock as the greatest painter of his generation, commenting on the all-over gestural canvases, the fact that Pollock uses the entire canvas. So in the 1955 essay, American Type Painting, Greenberg promotes the work of abstract expressionists, namely Jackson Pollock and Barnett Newman, as the next stage in modern art, arguing that these painters are moving towards greater emphasis on the flatness of the picture plane. And so, if we talk about the history of the avant-garde, and avant-garde originating, as we've kind of said, as a military term, meaning that modernism exists to call culture forward, that if the advance guard was sent in battle, that the artists see themselves as this kind of advance guard to bring culture forward. And so how do you do that in this post-war era? And that's going to be a really key thing, and that correlates with kitsch for Greenberg. Kitsch being artwork that we think of today as maybe tacky, gaudy. Essentially, the important thing about kitsch is that it is made for money. It's made to make money. You make kitsch art to sell it. And that's one of the interesting things. I have this sculpture here of Michael Jackson and his monkey Bubbles by Jeff Koons, that is some critics deride as pure kitsch. But so that's the kind of differentiation. And for Greenberg, he's not saying necessarily that kitsch is all bad. He thinks that there's a place for kitsch, but essentially that avant-garde art needs to be the exact opposite of kitsch, that there shouldn't be any kind of commodification property about it, that it is cerebral and that it brings a different kind of experience to the viewer than normal artists of the kind of kitsch persuasion do. So from this, I'm going to talk about a major concept in abstract expressionism that kind of combats kitsch, so to speak. And this is something that we've talked about before, but we're going to talk about the sublime today, because this is a concept that's really central to abstract expressionism and is something that almost every single artist in this group grapples with and tries to express in their works. So as I said, there are a number of artists that are working at this period, and I hope that the group presentation is going to touch on this and you're going to hopefully get into it in your readings as well. So I'm going to talk mainly about the work of Barnett Newman as a major example. I'm going to use Newman for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think he's fascinating. He worked as an art critic, curator, and promoter for his friends in the early years, and he actually ran for mayor of New York and explained his reasoning for doing so in a manifesto called On the Need for Political Action by Men of Culture, which is just cool. But I'm also using him because he really wasn't highly appreciated during his lifetime compared with the kind of rock star status that people like Pollock and Willem de Kooning and Rothko would attain. A lot of people that if you've seen one Barnett Newman, you've seen them all. But his work is deep and powerful when you experience it in person. The huge fields of color that you see in the trademark zips, the kind of vertical figures you see here in his pictures, really set him apart from the pure gestural abstraction of many of his peers. And the response to his mature work, even from friends, was pretty mute when he first began to exhibit it, and it wasn't later in his career that he began to receive acclaim. He would become a touchstone for both minimalists and a second generation of color field painters, such as you see here in the minimalist sculpture by Carl Andre. But commenting on one of Newman's exhibitions in 1959, the art critic Thomas B. Hess wrote, quote, "He changed in about a year's time from an outcast or crank into the father figure of two generations." So I think that kind of posits him as this really, really important pivotal figure here. But secondly, I'm using him because he read so much and he wrote so much, and because he really tries hard to articulate his aims and the aims of his fellow artists. Many of these aims are wrapped up in this very major concept of the attempt to depict the sublime. And we've talked about the sublime being this very complex philosophical concept that has been around since the 1st or 2nd century. So we can camp out for a minute and really return to that, unpack what the sublime is and what the effect on us is, and then show you through his work how he sees the sublime and what he thinks the role of the artist should be, and then taking both of these to show how he used art to try to come to terms with the trauma of the recent past and to move forward beyond this trauma by taking part in acts of creation. So to do this, we have to start with what's happened in the world, right? World War II, we have the Holocaust, we have the atomic bomb, and this leads us to existentialism and the philosophy of Sartre in a way that really hadn't been seen on this scale. You have Nietzsche and all of these figures that are prominent towards the beginning of the century, but this war and this devastation and the cruelty of the Holocaust really makes people begin to ask, why are we here? What's the overall purpose? If we can do this to each other, what is the point in our life of being on this planet? And so thinking about trauma, thinking about this period and culture, we also want to talk about the German philosopher Theodor Adorno. And he writes a lot of really beautiful things, but I want to open with this quote where he says, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." And I start with this to underscore the huge impact that World War II and the dropping of the atomic bomb had on anybody who lived through it. Adorno is commenting on the fact that poets and artists in the aftermath of the Second World War can't write poetry because of the sheer impossibility of finding means of sufficiently encapsulating the atrocities that had ravaged modern civilization in words or images. To make this clearer, like, this statement here is not a verdict intended to silence artists or poets. It was restated a few different times by Adorno, and he does it specifically in response to poetry by a favorite poet of his, Paul Celan. And this is this commentary for arts and culture to respond from within and in the face of an experience of trauma and difficulty unlike they'd ever seen before. The tragedies, the violence, the loss created by this war basically made the forms of art that had been popular before the war seem less in a way or more trivial in the face of what happened. So, to go back to the statement, to write poetry after Auschwitz, it instead becomes this idea that we have to find new forms of language and new artistic methods that acknowledge the experience of this trauma. And I bring this up because abstract expressionists all experience similar feelings to Adorno in some way, shape, or form. Newman and Rothko, as well as many of their fellow artists, were devastated by the war. Both were Jewish and either first or second generation immigrants with family back in the old world who were affected directly by the war and by the Nazi treatment of the Jews. Barnett Newman's wife had Jewish family members in France who were forced to flee. And I say this because while I think that the war shouldn't be everything when we're looking for meanings in the work of these artists, but it can't help but play a big role, right? It absolutely changed everything, even if it did take time. Only after the war did Americans truly understand the scale of the atrocities of what was going on in concentration camps and even of our own culpability in using the atomic bomb. So, taking all this in, Newman, speaking on the search for what to paint after the war, put it like this. He said, "Years ago, we felt the moral crisis of a world in shambles, a world devastated by a Great Depression and a fierce world war, and it was impossible at that time to paint the kind of painting that we were doing." And at this point, he lists various representative subjects. At the same time, we could not move into the situation of a pure world of unorganized shapes, forms, color, a world of sensation. This was our moral crisis in relation to what to paint. So we actually began, so to speak, from scratch, as if painting were not only dead, but never existed. I'm going to come back to this statement later on, but keep this in your mind, this idea that you have to start with something totally new, that these artists are trying to convey their experience that they couldn't put into words or use pre-existing forms for, because this is so much of what's going on in abstract expressionism. It's not everything, but it's a pretty major influence as we move forward in time from the end of the war in 1945 to the start of this movement. So with that in mind, I want to shift back to the sublime. And just to have a brief refresher, when we explore the work of the abstract expressionists, I really want us to understand this because they're all so deeply engaged with the sublime. Barnett Newman actually wrote an essay in 1948 called "The Sublime Is Now," which I'll touch on in a little bit. But it's at this point in the history of the word sublime that the visual artists became again after the war kind of deeply intrigued by the challenge of representing it, asking how can an artist paint the sensation that we feel when words fail us, when we find ourselves maybe close to or even beyond the limits of reason. So bringing back Caspar David Friedrich to underscore what I'm talking about, especially I think it's helpful to look at Monk by the Sea again, where you have this kind of hazy and diffuse atmosphere, almost looking like a precursor to a Rothko painting, but a century and a half before. But you have to look very close to see the monk who is small, here again with his back to us, looking at the ocean. I also want to bring this monk to our attention because it'll coincide with this idea that this kind of experience lends itself naturally to contemplation. And Friedrich was, of course, captivated by the idea of encountering nature in solitude, whether you're on top of a mountain or on the edge of a sea, but basically getting away from urban civilization at this time. And there's this idea that you need to separate yourself from civilization and reacquaint yourself with the greater forces of nature, especially if you're an artist, so that you can come back and paint art that carries great spiritual weight and power. So you think about the other things inherent in the sublime: chaos, wildness. They're admired, and artists are inspired to try and represent the emotional possibilities of the sublime, that mankind could feel uplifted by nature but also overwhelmed and insignificant. And the abstract expressionists are going to grab onto this idea, and I think it makes sense why when you're thinking about being in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the World War. As art historians, we talk a lot about the abstract expressionists and how they have rejected a number of movements came before, like Cubism, and replaced the geometric vocabulary and the intellectual structure of Cubism with a new kind of space that's created by flattened, spreading expanses of light and color and planes. But I think it's important that we not overlook that this development of abstract expressionist movement isn't only based on formal needs, but also by emotional needs. That in the anxieties of the post war atomic age suddenly seem to find root in the romantic tradition of the irrational and the sublime and the awesome, as well as using this kind of romantic vocabulary of boundless energies and limitless spaces. The idea is to convey experiences rather than forms, and this is going to be central to abstract expressionism. So, like the painting that you see here by J.M.W. Turner, this kind of fearsome black lake will coincide with what we see in American painting. And here is where I kind of want to take a weird turn, but I want to turn now to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I want to bring in Emerson to our discussion for a number of reasons, but the main one being that we know that Newman read him. When Barnett Newman died, he left his entire library intact, and he had a number of books by Emerson and his fellow transcendentalist Thoreau. But not only that, Newman, when he got married, he took his wife to Concord on their honeymoon so that they could walk in the footsteps of Emerson and Thoreau and really soak up their histories. And, you guys should really think about that someday if you're not married yet, because, honeymoons, beaches can be overrated. Why not go and soak in transcendentalism's roots? Whatever. Emerson is crucial here because he talks so much about the sublime and because he also has a lot to say about the role of the artist. And this is really going to shape Newman. So much so that, as you see here, one of his paintings would be named Concord in honor of Emerson. But one of his most famous most famous experiences of the sublime basically starts the transcendentalist movement. To set it up for you, he's walking through the Boston Common, through the kind of wooded area in Boston. And in nature, he says, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blight air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. So what does he mean by this? Beyond the idea that he becomes a transparent eyeball, which was almost immediately made fun of by his friends and contemporaries in cartoons, basically this means he is experiencing the sublime in nature. But this perception of the sublime shakes him to his core. When he says all mean egotism vanishes, he realizes how small he is and how insignificant he is in the great scheme of things, and he's overwhelmed by this quasi-mystical experience. And this moment is kind of a watershed moment for him. And this is when he starts thinking about what nature is like, what we are like, and how artists and poets can help lead the public into new understandings of the world around them by conveying their own experiences. So for Emerson, the poet and the artist were pivotal people here. Their job is to propel culture, to give form to it through new constructions of language and visual symbols. Emerson basically says that we need this kind of artist prophet who interacts with God and can lead culture forward. So, when we return to Newman and the abstract expressionists, we see that their problem with finding a kind of art that's appropriate to conveying their experience after World War II, after Auschwitz, after the dropping of the atomic bomb, is that they couldn't find an artistic language that, in their perspective, could convey the sublime. So, this is where Emerson is so key for them in breaking with outmoded means of representation and to re engage with the sublime. So I want to just take a moment to compare some things that Emerson said with an excerpt from Barnett Newman's essay, The Sublime is Now, again written in 1948. So starting with Emerson, he says, we have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. A nation of men will for the first time exist because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul, which also inspires all men. And thus, in our fine arts, not imitation but creation is the aim. In landscapes, the painter should give the suggestion of a fairer creation than we know. So now compare this to Newman. The failure of European art to achieve the sublime is due to this blind desire to exist inside the reality of sensation, the objective world. I believe that here in America, some of us, free from the weight of European culture, are finding the answer by completely denying that art has any concern with the problem of beauty and where to find it. We are creating images whose reality is self evident and which are devoid of the props and crutches that evoke associations with outmoded images. Or perhaps freeing ourselves of the obsolete props of an outmoded and antiquated legend, freeing ourselves from the impediments of memory, association, nostalgia, legend, and myth that have been the devices of Western European painting. So I bring this connection to your attention to show you that Newman and his fellow abstract expressionists are engaged in a conversation about the role of art and about historical precedents. Essentially, in this statement, Newman is placing his art in a conversation with both art and history, and holding on to helpful ideas and tools like the idea of the sublime, but otherwise saying that abstract expressionism strips away all of the artistic conventions from before in order to really be able to achieve success in the depiction of the sublime in their work. And to do this, they can't rely on old artistic motifs or forms to demonstrate this feeling or experience, but they need something altogether different. So now, with all of this theory and philosophy and history under our belts, let's look at some paintings, shall we? Almost all of the major abstract expressionists have early work that shows the influence of surrealism and automatism, that by letting the pen or the paintbrush kind of begin and you use this artwork to plumb your unconscious, Freudian psychology. They seem to evoke cosmic and mythological themes of beginning and origin. Pagan Void, for example, that you see here, is a painting about the need for a new life. And so you see a number of different kind of things that could be referenced here, whether it's an amoeba, the kind of cellular beginnings of life, or kind of cosmic appearance of maybe a universe or constellations, or maybe an egg, the source of new life itself. But I think it's important to note that most of his early works, to find one as early as this is pretty rare. He destroyed most of the work he did before he found his mature style. But works like this are a part of his search. He's searching for a new artistic language dealing with the trauma of the war and its effect on the world. So we're going to come back to this in a second, but just to give you another example, you have people like Mark Rothko who are delving into mythology, and here we have the sacrifice of Iphigenia, and then here Jackson Pollock begins to explore mythology in The Guardians of the Secret. You have a number of different kind of references here. But if you look at this kind of central part that is a tablet of sorts, there seems to be this kind of writing on it that maybe if you were just given the tools, the key to be able to understand it, that there's this kind of inherent ancient mythological knowledge that could be revealed to you here. I also think at this point it's important to note that people like Pollock were really influenced by Native American spirituality and spiritual practices and artistic practices. And so in 1941, there is this landmark exhibition of Navajo sand painting. And so I want you to look at this because Jackson Pollock talks about how formative this was for him. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, the kind of obvious gravity-based artwork, right? But two, because Navajo sand painting is more about the process and this being a kind of spiritual process than necessarily the final product. The final product, in essence, is temporary and made to be temporary, but that the sand painting becomes this focus on the artistic creation, the act of creation itself. So thinking about this and thinking about the shift to focus on mythology, on all of these different ways to get to the meaning for man's existence. Essentially what all myths are trying to tell the story of why we're here, right? So this is why mythology, even pagan mythology like we have here, is important for the abstract expressionists. They're trying to get to this kind of deep truth about the human existence. So we have Barnett Newman who's searching for a new artistic language, and he's dealing with the trauma of the war and its effect on the world, and then in 1947, his father dies. And this culmination of trauma really pushes him to the art that we come to recognize as his mature style, which begins the very next year. So the best place to start, both literally and figuratively, is at 1. 1 meant 1, to be exact, and this is Newman's breakthrough piece. In an interview with Thomas Hess, he said that he did it on his birthday, which gives it an extra special significance. I mean, think about it. When he looks back on this, he basically birthed his new form of art on his birthday. But anyway, he said that he was preparing the canvas as usual, and he laid the masking tape and was painting the background, and then in a momentary impulse, he took a lighter cadmium red and painted it over the masking tape. And you can see it here if we zoom in a little closer, maybe the shadow of the blue behind. And he stopped, and he was flabbergasted and really, really impressed with himself, deciding that he had done something important. So then he sat back to figure out exactly what it was that he had done. So what has he done? So first and foremost, he left the painting as is for about 8 months and just sat with it and thought about it. And this is the first painting of what most of the rest of his career would look like, the use of these lines, which he calls zips. And these zips become symbolic, and he's adamant in saying that they don't divide the canvas, but unite the two sides as one. These would be the major motif in the rest of his work of one or more vertical bands that run from the top to the bottom of the panel, usually in colors that differ either slightly or greatly from the surrounding field. Sometimes the bands will be of different widths. In the same painting, sometimes they're going to differ from one another in color, but this is the really breakthrough moment. So art historians look at this painting in a number of ways. Some say it's purely intellectual. It's a set of ideas about what painting should be, a kind of psychoanalysis about the painter recording his impulse, that the painting is the materialization or the embodiment of creative energy, if that makes sense. But other people look at this as an entirely spiritual canvas, a kind of proto-biblical image. There's a long line of scholarship that sees his childhood in a devout Jewish environment as producing this notion of a kind of biblical origin, that this is the ultimate and primary division, dividing light from darkness, male from female, good from evil, etc. This is Newman's first move, and it's reenacting God's primal gesture, and it is a presentation of the gesture itself, the zip as a kind of independent shape. So I hope that makes sense. If you're trying to take it either intellectually or spiritually, you're alone, you're simplifying what's so remarkable about this painting. Rather than being an either or interpretation, it's a both and. In a way, 1 meant 1 signifies for Newman this momentous enactment of painting itself as a tabula rasa, or this instance of creation in many senses of the word. He said that 1 meant 1 was a painting, whereas what he had done before were merely pictures. So think for a minute about how we're supposed to understand the difference. Newman is maybe saying that with a picture, we think of an illusionary space where various objects or forms are represented within. So the viewer then looks through the surface of a picture as if it's through a window into virtual space where various objects are composed. Whether you're talking about the Virgin and Child surrounded by saints and angels, like in this painting by Cimabue. Now, this is a little hyperbolic, and I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with him, but it's important to understand what Newman is saying. In contrast, in his distinction between a picture and a painting, that in a painting, by contrast, the surface is opaque like a wall. We're not supposed to see through it. We stand in a real relationship with it rather than in an illusionary relationship with what it represents. Newman said of it, "The streak was always going through the atmosphere. I was trying to create a world around it." So the streak in 1 meant 1 is not in an atmosphere of its own or in any kind of pictorial illusionary space. It's on the surface and in the same space that we are. So the painting and the viewer exist in the same reality. And so in this way, we become more aware of our bodies in space, and I'm going to come back to this idea in a minute. But I think it's important to think about all of these things when we look at Newman's paintings. This line, this zip, as he calls it, is a mark of his energy, but it's also a reminder of our bodies in space, as well as a record of the kind of creative impulse that asks, why we create things. It brings all of these things into one canvas. And most likely, for that reason, he retroactively names this canvas One Mint One. So, what is one mint? Well, for one, it's a bit of a pun. At its most basic level, one is a number. One is the loneliest number, right? One is the first, most basic state. One is a quantity, but one mint also speaks of a great loneliness or a sense of isolation, doesn't it? The sense of being one in the midst of the sublime or one in the face of the void. But it's also the state of being at one, if that makes sense. It's derived from the archaic English word that meant at one or atonement. Atonement is a really loaded word, I know. But for one, atonement has religious connotations, meaning rectified or restored, but it also means that in a larger sense as well, even beyond religion. It's also interesting to think of this in light of the idea of restoration for the world after World War II, isn't? Like becoming restored or a sense of being at one again. These really overwhelming ideas should take us back to the sublime. If we basically remember that beauty is represented by taste and form, whereas the sublime concerns feeling, emotion, and formlessness, one mint is all about feeling and about formlessness. The zip is an action on the formless canvas. This is a huge idea. So let's look at another painting to see if it helps us clarify this a little bit. If you're in the gallery at MoMA, you're looking at One Mint One, you might miss One Mint One actually, or at least you might not spend that much time in front of it. It's not that big. After all, it's about 27 inches by 16 inches. But if you turn around, this painting, Vir Heroica Sublimus, is pretty much impossible to miss. It hangs directly across the gallery from it. We translate this from the Latin as man heroic and sublime. This canvas is enormous, you guys. It's almost 8 feet tall, almost 18 feet wide. This was, at the time, the largest painting he had ever done, although, believe it or not, he would go on to create even bigger works. But when he first exhibited this work at Betty Parsons Gallery in New York, he tacked a notice to the wall that read, "There is a tendency to look at large pictures from a distance. The large pictures in this exhibition are intended to be seen from a short distance." Or, put it the way that Mark Rothko puts it, "I paint big to be intimate." These guys intend their audiences to view this and other large paintings from a close vantage point, allowing for the colors and the zips to fully surround them. Rothko wants viewers to do this with his paintings too. You know, when you stand there and the color takes up your entire area of perception, you find yourself unsettled and a little dizzied maybe, and like the color has saturated you. And this is exactly what Newman wanted, to draw out a reaction, a visceral reaction from his viewers because of the pure color and the overwhelming scale of the painting. And in doing this, we actually become the figure in a Caspar David Friedrich painting, but he's removing the middleman, so to speak. So we're confronted with the sublime immediately in front of us. So in this painting, which is more complex than it initially appears, Newman's zips are variously solid or kind of wavering, and they create a square in the center with asymmetrical spaces on the perimeter. But what are we supposed to do with the title? Man, heroic, and sublime. Clearly, it's supposed to make us think about the human body, but how? So, relating to bodies, a lot of scholars that have said that the various tones of the zips relate to the kind of cadmium red dark of the field, as the body of man relates to the body of the earth. So again, when you're standing in front of the painting, especially thinking about how big it is, being 8 feet tall, 18 feet wide, you are absolutely aware of your own embodied existence, your size, and how you occupy space, especially if you view the painting how Newman wants you to, up close. You have to physically move around to basically experience it all. And for this reason, a lot of scholars draw comparisons between Newman's zips and the very slender forms of Giacometti's sculptures, reinforcing Newman's own connections between his paintings and the viewer's body. You know, that we are vertical elements on the horizontal face of the earth, right? Incidentally, we're not going to talk about Giacometti today too much, but I think it's important to bring him in as a post-war artist, that one of the reasons he does these long attenuated figures is they are to represent our own fragility. in the face of the world, especially after the atomic bomb. But more than that, though, is this idea that man is heroic and sublime, and this connects back to Newman's own obsession with going back to the moment of creation and humans' innate possibilities. He wrote an article in 1947 that reinforces this idea, and this article is entitled "The First Man Was an Artist." So, in this article, he writes man's first expression, like his first dream, was an aesthetic one. Speech was a poetic outcry rather than a demand for communication. Original man, shouting his consonants, did so in yells of awe and anger at his tragic state, at his own self awareness, and at his own helplessness before the void. Now, obviously, Barnett Newman is speaking metaphorically here, but I think it's a part of his artistic narrative and maybe a psychological interpretation of sorts, a way of understanding the urge for man to create. And importantly, for Newman, man speaks to understand his own situation in the face of the void, or maybe we can read that as the sublime. After he says this, he basically goes on to argue that the point of being an artist now is to find our way back to humanity's primordial possibilities. He says, instead of making cathedrals out of Christ, man, or life, we are making it out of ourselves, out of our own feelings. Or, put it another way, that humankind's natural desire in the arts to express our own experiences and recognizing the sublimity of the things that are around us and the things that happen in the world, that this is the point. That we're trying to connect to the sublime or even to God around us. And I think that's really key. And I don't think I'm overstating that here, this idea of the eternal. So I think that's more even apparent in the last work that I'm going to talk about by him today. He created over a decade later, towards the end of his career, and this is the Broken Obelisk. And you may have seen this sculpture. There are 4 of them around the world. This one that I'm going to talk about today is in front of the Menil and the Rothko Chapel in Houston. This seems to be, at first glance, a strong departure from his Zip paintings. He had actually done a few sculptures before this, but they also were kind of in the Zip vein as well. They're kind of more slender metal rectangular columns. But this Broken Obelisk is by far his most massive sculpture. It's made out of Corten steel, which Corten steel is something that is really popular, especially mid-century, and is continuing to be popular now because it has this kind of patina that actually enforces or reinvigorates rather than deteriorates the actual structure of the steel. So it looks like rust, it looks like it's maybe weakening the elemental structure of the steel, but that it's actually providing a kind of protective coating. But it's an industrial material, something else to think about too. But it's made out of Corten steel. It's about 26 feet high. But the crux of the piece and the kind of source of its paradoxical lightness is this very narrow point at which the enormous inverted obelisk balances on the tip of this 8.5-foot high pyramid. So the area of contact is actually only 2.25 inch square. There's a steel rod inside the structure that holds the 2 pieces in perfect alignment. But you have this simultaneous movement of upward and downward forces going on here, colliding at this point. So we have 2 monumental forms. We have a pyramid on the bottom, which is an elemental form, but you also culturally think of, when you see the shape, you think of the Egyptian house of the dead pharaohs, right? And you think about obelisks. Maybe you remember from your survey courses that they originated in ancient Egypt too. According to Pliny, Egyptian obelisk represented rays of the sun. It was also a fertility symbol, a phallic or regenerative symbol, and it even is connected back to the stone that is said to have housed the phoenix in Heliopolis in ancient Egypt. So you have this combination of death and fertility or birth, and you think about a phoenix, what a phoenix does is reborn from its own ashes. So you have death, fertility, birth, resurrection, all coming from this. And then to think about the obelisk in a more modern term, it also has become a decidedly American symbol, thinking about the Washington Monument, who is himself about as close to a deified man that our country can have. And so all of these are working in Newman's mind as he creates. Though he had designed the sculpture with no particular site in 1963 and 64. It was fabricated a couple of years later in an edition of four, as I said. So in 1969, the Menils announced that they wanted to have this one for Houston, and they wanted to create it or to purchase it in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. and that because it seemed like an ideal association for them, and Newman readily agreed. And I want us to pause here and think about that for a minute. The universe, how universal this form is, that he had created it before the Menils asked for it to be for this built for this purpose, but this goes back to using these kind of basic forms and universal symbols. And I bring this in because I think it's also ironic that King had delivered his most famous speech in Washington in 1963 from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to civil rights marchers assembled in the park below, with the white needle of the Washington obelisk right ahead from him, right across from him as he's saying his "I Have a Dream" speech. So you think about MLK, you think about why they would want to put this in Houston to commemorate his life after his assassination. He was an American preacher, a civil rights leader, a cornerstone, if you will, of the progressive movement who had been taken down prematurely. So this sculpture then is really fitting because it's rising, but it's torn down at the top. So the link between heaven and earth has been broken, and we're constantly aware of this rupture when we look at the sculpture. Newman himself describes the sculpture in these terms. He says, "It's concerned with life, and I hope I have transformed its tragic content into a glimpse of the sublime." So how does he do this? Does he actually transform the tragic into the sublime? Is there a difference between these ideas? If you look closely at the bottom of the base of the pyramid, he's roughened it a little bit, and this helps us to relate the two parts, the jagged edge of the top and the rough edge of the bottom, to each other. He's implying here that this one form, this column of hope and aspiration, will eventually break and fall and become the opposite, the kind of solid, the fixed, and the dead. But because he puts this grouping together on a reflective pool, that this becomes this constant reflection, this constant regeneration of these ideas. This expresses the basic idea of death to life, becoming in a kind of endless circle. And I find this so powerful in the simplest forms that he uses in these incredibly philosophically dense ideas that he makes his forms hold. He works constantly with these meta kind of ideas, these overarching themes for humanity that are so often born out of tragedy, particularly in his experience. World War II, the death of his father, and then the death of a modern icon of peaceful progress. But he's always working to take tragedy and to transform it into the sublime, or into a way that we can encounter the divine, or the absolute, as he would say, and to feel our own presence in relation to it. And I think this is what's really remarkable, is how he uses this tragedy to give his own work of art a sense of the sublime, of something greater than ourselves. He always spoke about artists' need for freeing ourselves of impediments in order to produce images of revelation, real and concrete. So in doing this, and in addition to freeing ourselves from forms and boundaries of art forms that no longer work to express the culture that he lives in, he's also using his art to address the trauma of life's occurrences and to move out of tragedy and into a new era, to start from square one, so to speak. So I'm going to come back to Newman at the end. I just briefly also want to touch on Mark Rothko, because he's so pivotal, and he represents this kind of tragic underpinning as well of the abstract expressionist movement. He was born in Russia, and he and his family immigrated to the United States when he was 10 years old and settled in Portland, Oregon. He attended Yale University in 1921, where he studied a number of different things. His initial intention was to become an engineer or an attorney, but he gave up his studies in 1923 and moved to New York City. So during the 1940s, his imagery became increasingly symbolic. You think about the social climate of anxiety that dominated the late 1930s and the years of the war. But images from everyday life began to appear somewhat outmoded, like what we've seen. So he talks about uh, the kind of tragedy of the human condition, and like Barnett Newman, he writes, "It was with the utmost reluctance that I found the figure could not serve my purposes, but a time came when none of us could use the figure without mutilating it." So essentially, once he refused to use any kind of reference to the human body, like you have here in the sacrifice of Iphigenia, he's kind of forced to find alternate means of expression. And in 1943, he and Barnett Newman and Adolf Gottlieb wrote a letter to the New York Times, and I think this is worth quoting a good bit of the letter here. He says, "It's a widely accepted notion among painters that it does not matter what one paints as long as it is well painted. This is the essence of academicism. There is no such thing as a good painting about nothing. We assert that the subject is crucial, and that only that subject matter is valid, which is tragic and timeless. That is why we profess a spiritual kinship with the primitive and archaic art. We favor the simple expression of complex thought. We are for the large shape because it has the impact of the unequivocal. We wish to reassert the picture plane. We are for flat forms because they destroy illusion and reveal truth." So hopefully you can see some similarities here with what Barnett Newman is doing as well. The Sacrifice of Iphigenia exemplifies Rothko's interest in classical literature. He describes another painting also inspired by the writings of Aeschylus. He explains, "The picture deals not with the particular anecdote, but rather with the spirit of myth, which is generic to all myths at all times." So you get this idea that he's trying to hone in on some universal truth about existence here. So figurative associations and references to the natural world will essentially disappear from Rothko's paintings of the late 1940s. You see here, if we add in this one to kind of give you a bridge, number 1 or number 18, however you want to look at it, is titled variously. But the paintings from 1947 to 1949, you have these linear elements are progressively eliminated. You have these asymmetrical arranged patches of color that become the basis for his compositions. These paintings, these early paintings from 47 to 49, are sometimes referred to as multiforms to distinguish them from the more distilled compositions that follow. You can, in some of these, you can kind of see the play of figure, line, and ground that he uses in his early works, and the various textural effects that you look at here. He's experimenting in watercolor and gouache and trying to figure out how to get these different kind of textures on the actual picture plane. In the multiforms, the liquid paint soaks the canvas, leaving very soft, indistinct edges, while wider shapes, wider outlines surround some of the shapes, almost like halos. Rothko now relies on these shapes that replace the earlier biomorphic motifs or mythic motifs to convey just a pure emotional state. Throughout the series, especially 47 through 49, you see a exploration of a greater breadth of both composition and scale and a very high attention to color. At this point, he begins to paint the edges of his stretch canvases, which he displayed without confining frames, which is kind of a big moment for him. Even when it seems least evident to the viewer, though, subject matter in his work has a central place. And this is maybe nowhere more true or more elusive than in his more pure abstract pictures of the 1950s. So by 1949, Rothko had introduced a compositional format that he would continue to develop throughout his career. And these are composed of several vertically aligned rectangular forms set within a color field. And this image, quote unquote, lends itself to a remarkable diversity of appearances. If you've seen these, you can understand how differently they can appear. So these classic paintings of the 1950s are characterized by expanding dimensions, increasingly simplified use of form, brilliant colors, and broad, very thin washes of color. In his large floating rectangles of color, they seem to engulf you as the spectator. And he's got this real nuance, this mastery of brushwork to use color contrasts and modulations here. By 1947, he largely abandons conventional titles, usually just resorting to numbers or colors in order to distinguish one work from another. And he also begins to resist explaining the meanings behind his work. He says silence is so accurate. He fears, like Kandinsky did years before him, that words can only paralyze your mind as the viewer and paralyze your imagination. Let your irrational side experience it first. So by 1950, Rothko had reduced the number of floating rectangles to 2, 3, or 4, had aligned them on this colored ground, arriving at his signature style. And from that time on, he basically worked almost invariably within this format. And I think he's trying to get into this range of moods, of the sublime, of expression, of experience. And for him, he's also trying really hard to communicate this initial religious experience that felt by him as he makes it. That his paintings embody human emotion, human spirituality, and human drama that he says is the central focus of his work. For him, color draws in the viewer by being enticing the viewer to come closer. And the color is basically to bear the burden of the metaphysical context or content. I know that's a lot, but this is key here. This is the dilemma that we share with Rothko, that what we see, this color alone, is kind of the vehicle of what he's trying to communicate spiritually. He was dismayed. He was irritated when people described him basically as only a color painter. He says, I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. And if you are only moved by their color relationships, then you miss the point. Pretty bold, right? So what he's painting is an experience that has as its roots romanticism, right? The mysterious presence, the religious experience, links him to kind of Friedrich Turner rather than to Matisse or the early modernists. He could never accept art as being sheerly pleasurable or sensual. That's not enough. It's also important to note that for him, the spectator alone makes the picture active. That what he paints isn't the final composition, but it's a part of the viewer that is enacted when the viewer stands in front of it, if that makes sense. So I wanted to finish today by talking also about the Rothko Chapel, because this is something that if you're ever in Houston, you need to come see, because it's a really powerful experience, and most people that go there, you either love it or you hate it, and I think the important thing here is to sit with it for a moment. So I want to talk about this just for a moment, to think about the aims of the Menils, as you see here in the bottom left. They were collectors of modern and contemporary art, and their collection in Houston is amazing. They also helped to found the Dia Foundation, which still provides money and assistance to artists today. But so they worked with Mark Rothko. They approached him to create a suite of paintings for this chapel. And essentially, they wanted this to be an interfaith chapel that could be used for a number of different things. And so they consulted with the architect Philip Johnson. They were really struck by this chapel in Tuscany that is this kind of 8-sided form, and you can see that here. And so they began to think about how to create this kind of contemplative space that's appropriate for interfaith reflection, for any kind of gathering, so to speak. And so this chapel format is essentially octagonal, give or take some, but it's made to house Rothko's 14 canvases. So I want us to think about this for a moment and think about what he intends. And you remember that he wants you to step up close so that the pure color is all we see. that he wants us to temporarily lose sight of our other surroundings, to open us up for new spiritual or emotional experiences. And there's a reason that he creates these paintings in particular for a chapel setting. He thought of these paintings as vehicles to meet God wherever we are. So if you look at these, they seem very simple at first. They seem like they're either just black or purple. And a lot of people I've seen will just walk straight in, then be very nonplussed, and walk right back out. But if you see, the point is you have to sit with them for a minute. Multiple glazes of dark pigments that are varying in their levels of opacity. They make the surface of these paintings feel flat, but then the longer you sit with them, they quiver, they vibrate, they offer a sense of atmospheric depth. He hoped that these compositional strategies would um, invite visual or emotional contemplation on the part of the viewer, creating conditions for silence and reflection. So he experimented and worked on these for about 2 years, more than 2 years, and he completed the suite of 14 paintings in 1967. There are 7 canvases with hard-edged black rectangles on maroon ground, and there are 7 purple tonal paintings. And he creates these at the height of his career and towards the end of his life. I think it's also important to note that the natural light that illuminates the murals is very, very important to Rothko because it accurately demonstrates or shows off the nuances, the subtleties of his color palette. They're a window for him, and this is different, I think, than Barnett Newman, but they're a window to the beyond. They're a window to contemplation, to the sublime. He says that the bright colors kind of stop your vision at canvas where dark colors go beyond. And here, you're definitely looking at the beyond. You're looking at the infinite. In a 1966 letter to the Menils, he writes, "The magnitude on every level of experience and meaning of the task which you have involved me exceeds all my preconception, and it is teaching me how to extend myself beyond what I first thought was possible for me." So here again, we have him dealing with these large themes and themes of trauma, themes of human suffering. I mean, I think there's a reason why he made 14 paintings, right? You think about the traditional iconography, the Stations of the Cross, that 14 would be an ideal number, but also will translate, being Jewish will translate to a number of different religions as well. There's a real sadness, a real mournful quality to them. I've seen people be emotional in front of these paintings, but there's also something more to them. For me, these paintings take me back to Eugene Peterson's translation of the Bible, The Message, where he writes, he says, "The moment of creation, when the earth was a bottomless emptiness, a sea of inky blackness. This is when God calls creation into being." So these paintings, while conveying a deep sense of sadness, is also an environment teeming with possibility, waiting for the presence of God to call it into life. And so the more you sit there, you start to see reds and greens and blues and purples permeate these canvases, that they're not just the monochromatic paintings that they appear from the very beginning. So with these paintings, we have to stop. We have to sit with them and move beyond them as flat black canvases to see these colors. And in the midst of darkness, these colors generally gradually emerge. So these are necessarily both incredibly cathartic paintings, but also contemplative as well. They are surprising in this very quiet space, and you find yourself maybe more open or receptive, no matter what your religious background is. Maybe allow you to be receptive to wait for a new poem or a new word from God. If you're to kind of paraphrase Adorno, we have to start from the very beginning. So in other words, I think this is very Judeo-Christian in that God took pause to consider creation on the 7th day. So likewise, to understand these paintings, we have to first be still. And I think that's really beautiful and key to think about. This is also an image I have that kind of demonstrates you how to look at these paintings like Newman and Rothko would have wanted you to. So to finish up today, going back to Barnett Newman, I can't get enough of this picture with the monocle. to think about this overall goal of art in this period of time, marked by trauma, by trying to emerge and find a new language to heal and reconstruct culture. There's admittedly more than a touch of exaggerated American exceptionalism in their work, this faith in the redemptive powers of the American experience, and the American spirit. But this is in accordance with what these artists believe is their purpose as artists or creators working in this new American culture. But even if we cast all that aside, we're left with this sense of confidence, right? Art can be renewed, and these artists are just the artists to renew it. Because, especially like Barnett Newman, felt in his bones that history is not a closed system of preset outcomes. If art is renewable, that you can start from new, so is society, so are politics. Possibilities are endless, he believed, not only for his art, but for those who will let themselves be transformed in the face of the sublime. And I think that's the takeaway. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how you guys react, how you respond to these works, how you maybe respond to the works of Jackson Pollock or Helen Frankenthal or some of the female artists working in this period. But I really enjoy this period of work and these artists because it's something that is so much more than what you initially see on the canvas. Anyways, have a great week, guys. I'm looking forward to your responses.